I'm glad to see that everybody found a place to park. And we're very sorry for the inconvenience that the parking happened to coincide with the event tonight. Um, well, good evening and welcome. This is the second in a series of 3 programs on the Civil War. And tonight we're going to explore Connecticut's Bohemian Brigade. This lecture series was created in partnership with Norwalk Community College's regional series of events and exhibitions focusing on Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War. Several libraries and historical societies in the area are offering unique and interesting and exciting programming related to these topics. There's a brochure in the back before you leave. If you want to know what all the other libraries in the area are doing, you can pick one of these up. And all of this program coincides with celebrations across the nation commemorating the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War. We will have our final lecture, Lincoln and Emancipation, on Wednesday, November 14th at 7 p.m. All programs are free and open to the public. Details and online registration are available on our website. I am pleased to introduce tonight Robert Berthelson, who will talk about the Bohemian Brigade, an informal cadre of civilian journalists and artists who chronicled the events of the war. Mr. Berthelson has had a lifelong interest in American history and nostalgia. He has produced over 50 illustrated lectures, including several historical documentaries on Connecticut history, the American Revolution, the Civil War, postcard collecting, early photography, stamp collecting, and nostalgia. Please join me in welcoming him tonight.
Thank you. Tonight, we're going to have a program that perhaps you aren't familiar with. The fact that the Civil War was so well documented, not only in photography, but also with the newspapers and other things that would not only bring the Civil War to the public, but also keep it for us very, very accurately and fully. The American Civil War has been termed the first modern war. The science and technology of warfare were revolutionized by the many developments introduced in the 1860s. Okay. There we go. A typical American newspaper in the early 1800s was a journal of opinion and a cheerleader of politicians. It was not much of a newspaper. Few editors made any effort to leave the office to gather information because most of what they published came to them in the mail. Early newspapers, coupled with the growth of a literate population, the literacy rate in the North reached 89% in 1850. The number of newspapers increased to over 2,500 on the eve of the Civil War. New York alone supported 17 daily newspapers, and thanks to the convenient rail service, the New York Herald, the New York Tribune, and New York Times offered same-day home delivery in Washington, D.C. Following the attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, the War of the Rebellion became the first war to be extensively reported by civilian journalists and artists who were hired to follow the armies into battlefield areas. The major newspapers sent teams of journalists and artists into the war zone. The New York Herald headquarters were operated out of a typical Army wagon, and there were many of these. In 1835, 26 years before the Civil War, James Gordon Bennett launched his New York Herald, a new penny paper of 4 pages. In less than a year, the paper sold almost 15,000 copies per day. Bennett's innovations made the Herald a landmark in the history of American journalism. He criticized all political parties, was the first to use the telegraph extensively in newspaper work, and the first to use illustrations for news articles. Bennett employed 63 war correspondents and spent over $500,000 on war reporting. Horace Greeley launched the New York Tribune in 1841. The Tribune was multifaceted, devoting space to politics, social reform, literary and intelligent endeavors, and news. It was very much Greeley's personal vehicle. Greeley made the Tribune an enormous success. By the eve of the Civil War, the New York Tribune had a total circulation of more than 250,000 readers. Charles Anderson Dana was managing editor of the Tribune, the first to hold that title in America. Walt Whitman described Dana as a trim-built man, well-dressed, with quick, watchful eyes. Dana was responsible for a major issue that has frequently been attributed to Horace Greeley, the Tribune's editor. On June 30th, 1861, 1 month before the Battle of Bull Run, the premature headline of the New York Daily Tribune read, "The Nation's War Cry." The nation's war cry, "Forward to Richmond, forward to Richmond." The rebel Congress must not be allowed to meet there on the 20th of July. By that date, the place must be held by the National Army. In 1851, Henry J. Raymond launched the New York Times. In his first editorial, he pledged that the Times would uphold every just effort to reform society, to infuse higher elements of well-being into our political and social organizations, and to improve the conditions and character of our fellow man. Raymond was responsible for the organization that we know today as the Associated Press. The Bohemian Brigade was made up of an informal cadre of civilian journalists and artists who had been hired by the major newspapers or worked as freelance reporters. They chose the name Bohemians, that they defined loosely as free thinkers and free lovers who lived by their art, spent profligately, and considered the world their own. Their favorite haunt when they were together in New York City was at Pfaff's Cave, a tavern not far from the area in Manhattan known as Printing House Square. The first building on the left is the Sunday Times, then the New York Tribune, and in the center, the New York Times. Inside the press room of the New York Tribune were 3 large presses, such as this 6-cylinder Hoe Lightning rotary steam-powered printing press. 34 feet high, fed by 8 sheet handlers, it could spit forth 20,000 impressions per hour, one side at a time. The public's appetite for illustration was as great as that for information, and by 1860, over 200 printmakers, of which the firm of Currier and Ives was perhaps the best known, were turning out hundreds of lithographs and copperplate engravings. The best printmakers could turn out only about 300 copies per day. Newspaper publishers were faced with a practical limitation. The newspapers found an interim solution, the ancient woodcut. Using a block of hard-grained wood, a skilled craftsman would cut away whatever was to be white in the front in the final printed area, leaving the lines and the letters to pick up the black ink. The block was then mounted in the printing frame along with the type. The American Civil War was also the first war to be extensively photographed. There were as many as 300 civilian photographers working with the Army of the Potomac throughout the war, and perhaps 10 times that number in the other armies and in the cities. The half-tone process that would allow photographs to be inserted directly into the newspapers, however, would not be invented until 1880, long after the Civil War was over. This photograph by Alexander Gardner shows dead Confederate soldiers on the Hagerstown Turnpike following the Battle of Antietam. Artists use photographs as guides when creating their illustrations. This drawing by Walton Tabor closely follows Gardner's photography. Timothy O'Sullivan's photograph of the pontoon bridges over the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg after the battle show a great deal of detail. Here, the drawing, when completed, preserves all of the details of the photograph, but adds a group of soldiers in the foreground and on the bridge on the right. Another severe limitation of Civil War photography was the long exposure time required to make an image, up to 20 seconds. Any movement of a man in this scene would be blurred. Closer examination shows several blurred faces. Civil War artists could make a sketch of an entire army in motion by skillfully using their memory and imagination once the action was over. Edwin Forbes made this sketch of Dunkirk Church during the Battle of Antietam. Forbes became a Civil War artist, joining the staff of Leslie's Illustrated newspaper at age 22 in 1861. He was attached to the Army of the Potomac and was one of the youngest artists to cover the entire war. Frank Leslie, shown on the left instructing a new employee, learned his trade in the Illustrated London News. He immigrated to New York City, where in 1855 he began publishing Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper, one of the first influential news weeklies. This sketch by Frank Leslie would have been sent to a team of staff engravers who would copy it onto a wood block and add details to complete portions of the sketch that are left to their skill. Thomas Nast was born in Germany and brought to America in 1846. He was 20 when he began his career as a draftsman for Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper. Nast frequently drew multiple images in his sketches, producing picture stories of the war. Alfred Woad immigrated to New York City from London in 1850. He learned to draw on wood blocks for engravers and landed a position as an illustrator for the New York Illustrated News. Woad embellished the newspaper's letterhead. When Woad joined Harper's Weekly in 1862, he became one of the most talented artists of the war. Alfred, along with his brother William, produced some 1,150 drawings throughout the conflict. Alfred Wode's sketch of the attack by the Confederate Louisiana Tigers during the Battle of Gettysburg has dissecting lines made by the engraver to assist in copying the drawing. One artist may have been an expert in figures, another on background, and still another on small details. Once the many blocks were finished, they would be bolted together to form the completed picture. Then an electrotyped metal impression was made for printing up to 100,000 copies. From the sketch pad to printed page, it took from 3 or 4 weeks. The final picture, which appeared in Harper's, faithfully follows Wode's original sketch. Andrew Carnegie was brought from Pittsburgh to Washington in April of 1861. He had 2 tasks. He brought with him a railroad force of tradesmen, trackmen, and bridge builders. His first task was to improve the Long Bridge and extend the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad across the Potomac River so that locomotives and cars could be used in Virginia. In 7 days, they had rebuilt the Long Bridge and extended the railroad from Washington to Alexandria. Carnegie's second task was to extend the military telegraph from Washington to Alexandria and Fairfax, Virginia, and other outlying points. For that, telegraphers were called for from all the leading systems. Before the Civil War, the telegraph had become a 50,000-mile network from Kansas to the Atlantic Ocean. Reporters referred to the new telegraph as the Lightning, and publishers frequently headed their columns "News from the Magnetic Telegraph." Lincoln essentially took over the entire system, an existing civilian telegraph system as it existed as the war progressed. It incorporated about 52 existing telegraph companies, the largest of which were Western Union and American Telegraph. All operators were civilian except the command staff, and they remained that way throughout the entire war. They were actually stationed near the front as it was learned how to extend the telegraph lines as near the battlefields as possible. The telegraph, designed by Samuel F.B. Morse in 1839, required the use of large batteries that were carried to the front in battery wagons, adapted from the large hospital wagons then in use. Telegraph operators had to be trained in the use of the Morse code. A portable United States magneto-electric signal telegraph set was developed by George W. Beardsley of New York in 1859. It made the cumbersome battery wagons unnecessary, and the higher voltages could use finer, lighter wire. An operator would turn a hand crank to produce the needed electricity. The main strength of the flying telegraph, as it was called, was the ease with which the wire could be strung. The operator did not have to learn Morse code, and they could be easily trained. The Army brought 40 of these machines to the mobile field telegraph. They were used extensively during the 1862 campaigns until the late 1863, when Secretary of War Stanton put the system under the United States Military Telegraph. These units weighed about 100 pounds each and were powered by magnetos rather than batteries. Alfred Wode featured this machine in one of his drawings, of which he said, "The machine is a simple one, worked by a handle, which is passed around a dial plate marked with numerals of the alphabet. By stopping at the necessary letters, a message is easily spelled out upon the instrument at the other end of the line, which repeats by a pointer every move on the dial plate. The whole thing is so simple that any man able to read and write can work it with facility. On September 24, 1861, Thaddeus Lowe inflated an observation balloon with hydrogen made from portable generators and ascended to more than 1,000 feet near Arlington, Virginia, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Using a Beardsley telegraph with wire strung along the tethering cable, Lowe began sending intelligence on the Confederate troops located in Falls Church, Virginia, more than 3 miles away. Union guns were aimed and fired accurately at the Confederate troops without actually being able to see them, a first in the history of warfare. This triumph led the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, to direct Lowe to build several additional balloons. The fleet consisted of the Intrepid, Constitution, United States, Washington, Eagle, Excelsior, and the original Union. Each balloon had enough cable to climb to 5,000 feet. Lowe provided information during the siege of Yorktown, at Fredericksburg, and during the Battle of Fair Oaks, Virginia. The use of balloons was short-lived, but the Beardsley telegraph system had been proven. The first reporter to arrive on the scene of the Civil War was William H. Russell of the London Times. He journeyed to the United States in 1860, anticipating news of the election of Abraham Lincoln. Upon meeting Russell, Lincoln said, "Mr. Russell, I am very glad to make your acquaintance and to see you in this country. The London Times is one of the greatest powers in the world. In fact, I don't know of anything that has much more power, except perhaps the Mississippi River." Russell wrote that he was impressed with Lincoln's shrewdness, humor, and natural sagacity. Russell's comments on the First Lady were far less flattering. The impression of homeliness produced by Mrs. Lincoln on first sight are not diminished by closer acquaintance. Stepping on toes right away. Russell took a 10-week journey through the South. He reported to London his belief that nothing on earth will induce the people of the South to return to the Union. He even suggested that the Confederates might want to become subjects of the British Crown. When his reports were read in the South, it was the beginning of their outrage. They felt betrayed. Russell visited a slave auction in Montgomery, Alabama, and reported, "I tried in vain to make myself believe that for $975, I could become as much the owner of that mass of blood, bone, and sinew, flesh and brains, as of the horse that stood by my side. Nothing could persuade me that he was not a man, a fellow creature." Russell traveled back to Washington, where the Capitol was still under construction. He noted that the stairways were slippery with tobacco juice. He said that messengers and doormen wore no distinctive dress like they did at Westminster, and senators looked like bakers or millers. He stressed at the end of the Battle of Bull Run, when the Federal troops were retreating to Washington. His dispatch to the London Times began, "I sit down to give my account of what I saw with my own eyes. In the first place, the repulse of the Federalists decided as it was, might have no serious effects whatever beyond the mere failure, but for the disgraceful conduct of the troops. Such scandalous behavior on the part of soldiers I should have considered impossible. He went on and on with his diatribe. Thomas Nast depicted Russell sitting against a tree, working on his dispatch. 1 month after Bull Run, copies of the London Times arrived in America, and the reaction was overwhelming. Readers hated every word. Newspapers labeled him Bull Run Russell. It was the one thing for American writers to question the leadership, bravery, and skill of American forces in the field of battle. It was quite another thing for a foreigner to offer criticism during a time of national peril. Russell was no longer welcome in America, and he sailed for home on April 9, 1862. Edmund Clarence Stedman of Hartford, Connecticut, was easily the best reporter on the field at Bull Run. He became editor of the Norwich Tribune in 1852 and of the Winstead Herald in 1854. 2 years later, Stedman joined the editorial staff of the New York World. Stedman wrote the best and fullest account of the Battle of Bull Run. Even now, how shall one pretend to give a verifiable narration of the whole battle, based on the heterogeneous statements of 1,000 men, a battle whose arena was a tract miles in breadth and length, interspersed with hills and forests, when contending forces were divided into dozens minor armies, continually interchanging their positions. Even the general commanding the field forces were ignorant at the close of the positions of his several corps, was ignorant of the beginning of the topography, the topography of the dangerous territory on which he attacked an overpowering foe. That's both accurate and perceptive. Most of the day, Stedman was in the company of a number of other correspondents. It was the first deployment of what the correspondents themselves would call their Bohemian Brigade. And in order to exchange, they flocked together, reporters still do it today, for companionship and comfort, and in order to exchange information. They also thought it was a good way to keep an eye on their competition. Thank you. George Alfred Townsend was the youngest correspondent of the war. He began his career while still a youngster in the Peninsula Campaign with McClellan's army. Throughout the war, he worked for the New York Herald and then later for the New York World. He gained a reputation as a great correspondent. His letters are the best out. Once, when Lincoln was asked if he had visited a place, he replied, "No, it is not necessary for me to go there. George Alfred Townsend has been there." On August 19, 1862, Henry W. Halleck, General-in-Chief of the Union Army, ordered all federal commanders to immediately remove from your army all newspaper reporters. The order was a serious problem for most reporters, some of whom found themselves behind enemy lines and subject to capture. The best any of them could do was to find some way to stay with the Army and to get news from the wounded or through friendships with the officers. George Washington Smalley graduated from Yale University in 1854. At the beginning of the war, he was appointed senior field commander for the New York Times, correspondent for New York Times. To circumvent the order of General Halleck, Smalley managed to get an assignment as an aide-de-camp to General John Sedgwick of Cornwall, Connecticut. I had met General Sedgwick before, he wrote in his post-war memoir, and I went to the general and I told him my difficulty. "Come along with me," he said. That was all the appointment I had. Smalley attached himself to General Joseph Hooker's entourage on the eve of the Battle of Antietam with Sedgwick's blessing. I rode with the staff, not one of whom I knew. Nobody took the trouble to ask who I was or why I was there. Early in the morning, General Hooker had scattered his staff to the winds. When he saw me, he said, "Who are you?" I told him. "Will you take an order for me?" "Certainly." "Tell the colonel of that regiment to take his men to the front and keep them there." I gave the order. Again the question, "Who are you?" "The order is General Hooker's. It must come to me from a staff officer or from my brigade commander." "Very good. I will report to General Hooker that you decline to obey." "Oh, for God's sake, don't do that. The rebels are too many for us, but I would rather face them than Hooker." Smalley spent this day on such special missions. Shrapnel tore his jacket and his horse was hit. Smalley's fatalistic manner caused Hooker's aides to proclaim him the bravest of the brave. And Hooker later said, "In all the experience I've had in war, I never saw the most veteran soldier exhibit the more tranquil fortitude and unshaken valor than that exhibited by that young man." Smalley worked out his lead for the Tribune. Battlefield of Antietam, Wednesday evening, September 17th, 1862. Fierce and desperate battle between 200,000 men has raged since daylight, yet night closes on an uncertain field. It is the greatest fight since Waterloo. All over the field contested with the obstinacy equal even in Waterloo. Smalley was unable to cover the entire battlefield at Antietam, so he had another Connecticut reporter cover the action in the left side of the field. John Evans of Willimantic was described as a red-whiskered, ghost-like man whose appearance aroused merriment wherever he went. Homer Byington of Norwalk, a reporter for the New York Tribune, wrote, "If the Army can't get up a fight, it has no small amount of fun out of poor Evans." Evans' description of the Battle of Burnside's Bridge found its way into Smalley's report. Burnside hesitated for hours in front of the bridge that should have been carried at once by a coup de main. McClellan's glass for the last half hour has seldom been turned away from the left. He sees clearly enough that Burnside is pressed. Looking down into the valley where 15,000 troops are laying, he turns a half-questioning look at Fitzjohn Porter. His troops are eager to get into the fight, but he thinks, they are the only reserves of the army. They cannot be spared. Writing all night, Smalley found a telegraph operator in the morning and sent several pages to the Tribune in Baltimore. Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, noted in his diary that day, General McClellan telegraphed to General Halleck in the War Department, "We are in the midst of a most terrible battle of the entire war, perhaps in history. Nothing of substance has come in since. His dispatches are seldom full, clear, or satisfactory. Behaved splendidly, performed handsomely. But what was accomplished is never told. Our anxiety is intense." When Smalley's dispatch arrived in Baltimore, the telegraph operator realized that it was the first news that had been received from Antietam. He relayed it to the War Department. So it was that around noon on the first coherent account of the Battle of of Antietam, a dispatch signed Smalley came to the hands of Abraham Lincoln. Somewhere near breakfast, the Tribune Extra hit the streets with the 6 columns about the Battle of Antietam. It was a masterpiece. Smalley had written it graphically, but with restraint and unmistakable conviction, explaining the battle plan, taking the reader over the whole field. He correctly appraised the trouble as poor coordination and the result as stalemate, but one that would probably force Lee back across the Potomac River. The soldier in the field was as eager to read about the battle as were the civilians. Although he may have been part of the action, he knew very little about what was going on around him. Newspaper and magazine vendors traveled with the armies to every kind of publication possible. So great was the soldiers' hunger for news from home as well as from the war front. Newspapers were delivered to camp wherever the Army was in an established location for any length of time between movements. The soldiers were always eager for the news. In October of 1861, when a reporter from the Cincinnati Commercial introduced himself to Brigadier General William Tecumseh Sherman, Sherman burst into a violent discourse on the iniquities of journalism. The reporter protested that he was only interested in the truth. Sherman replied, "We don't want the truth told about things here. That's what we don't want." "Truth, huh? No, sir. We don't want the enemy any better informed than he already is." He insisted that the reporter take the first train out for Louisville. Sherman was implacable, the most relentless enemy of the Bohemians ever knew. To one artist, Sherman said, "You fellows make the best paid spies that can be bought. Jeff Davis owes more to you than newspaper men than his army. Lincoln was universally hospitable and courteous to journalists. In 1858, he was photographed with a copy of the Chicago Press and Tribune. Lincoln was the first president not to select a specific newspaper to handle the news and policies of the administration. It is a policy that has continued to this day. Gideon Welles complained that Lincoln's openness with the press was despicable. He noted in his diary, "It is an infirmity of the president that he permits the little newsmongers to come around and be intimate. He has great inquisitiveness, likes to hear all the political gossip." When the war news was bad, Lincoln was often troubled with melancholy, and reporters' letters were studded with such instances. "The president is blue and cross this morning, and better this afternoon, and said it wasn't as bad as thought earlier." It was tacitly understood that Lincoln's remarks to reporters were not to be attributed to him in print. When Lincoln sent reinforcements to McClellan, for example, he said it was like shoveling flies across a barnyard. He compared General Meade's feeble pursuit of Lee after Gettysburg to an old woman shooing her geese across the creek. Lincoln was on friendly terms with the members of the Bohemian Brigade. Whenever he met one of them, his favorite question was, "What news have you?" He knew that they had better opportunities for observation than most of his informants, and they were less likely to have axes to grind. He often would tell them to come and see him whenever they were in Washington. Henry Wing, a young Connecticut reporter, found himself being led on by Lincoln one night in June of 1864 regarding General Grant. He appraised Grant as a reticent, introspective commander who had overcome his drinking habit and won an almost unlimited confidence of his men. Conscious that he had done most of the talking, he rose to leave in embarrassment. Lincoln said, "My boy, you have told me just what I want to know." The press was responsible for at least one dilemma of the president. Lincoln was exasperated with the inaction of General McClellan during the 7 days battles on the Virginia Peninsula, and he wanted to relieve him from command as early as May 1862. Unfortunately, the press idolized little Napoleon, and he had become a hero to the nation. Following the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln visited the Army to order McClellan to pursue the Army of Northern Virginia before Lee could escape. McClellan still did not move, and on November 5th, one day after the November congressional election, Lincoln replaced his reluctant general. Not all Civil War correspondents were members of the Bohemian Brigade. Not all were civilians. One such example was Samuel W. Fisk, captain of Company I, 14th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. Before entering service in August of 1862, Fisk was a minister in Madison, Connecticut. His roots were in Massachusetts, and he became a correspondent for the Springfield Republican. Writing under the pen name Dunn Brown, he provided 90 wartime letters, often opening his dispatch with, "Dear Republican." Following the Battle of Fredericksburg, he wrote, "Oh, Republican, my heart is sick and sad. Blood and wounds and death are before my eyes of those who are my friends, comrades, brothers. Another tremendous, terrible, murderous butchery of brave men was made Saturday, the 13th of December, a memorable day in the annals of this war. The Grand Army Corps of Sumner marched up against the heights back of the city, where the enemy lay behind strong fortifications, all bristling with cannon and protected by rifle pits. While our men must cross a wide space of clear open ground, swept by artillery that every discharge mowed down whole ranks of men." Another example of soldier correspondence with James Montgomery Bailey of Danbury, Connecticut, remembered fondly as the Danbury Newsman. James Bailey enlisted in Company C, 17th Connecticut Volunteers. He began writing letters back to the Danbury Times in August of 1862 and continued throughout his tour of duty using the pseudonym H.P. Manton. On April 28th, the 17th was positioned on the extreme right of the Union lines about 2 miles west of Chancellorsville, Virginia. Bailey wrote, "We knew that the enemy was forming on our right as we could hear orders given and the sound of moving artillery. At 6 p.m. our pickets were attacked, and in much less time than I can describe it, they had flanked us, pouring deadly fire into the advance of our division. Shot and shell flew over us in rapid succession and struck like hail. It was no time for sets of fours. It was a stampede. Knapsacks, haversacks, swords, all lay around loose, all thrown away in that longing desire to get out of the way of those whistling bullets and musical shells which flew so carelessly among us. The noise grew truly terrific. It seemed as if hell itself had been let loose on earth to to deafen men into submission. I reached the rapidly forming lines of the 2nd and the 12th Corps. Manton. On July 1st, the 17th Connecticut Regiment took up a position north of Gettysburg. With a Confederate force of 10,000 men under Jubal Early attacked, the 17th became the first Connecticut unit to see action in the three-day battle. The first Lieutenant Bayard Wilkinson's battery of Napoleon guns quickly drew fire from Confederate artillery. Wilkinson went down almost at first fire, wounded in his right leg. 11th Corps Artillery Chief Major Thomas Osborne met Bayard as he was being carried to the rear. He recalled, "I knew at a glance that his wound was fatal." Samuel Wilkinson was the chief Washington correspondent of the New York Tribune. He arrived at Gettysburg late in the afternoon of July 2nd and learned that his son Bayard had been wounded the day before. When Samuel Wilkinson reached General Meade's headquarters, he learned that his son had been wounded and captured. Sam found out about Bayard's death and recovered his body after Federal forces regained the battlefield. He wrote a stirring account of the battle while sitting near his son's grave. That report, Sam Wilkinson's thrilling word picture of Gettysburg, was printed in the New York Times. The 17th Connecticut was badly hit and lost several men in the first moments of the battle. The survivors, including James Bailey, were driven back across the rolling fields to the town. James Bailey wrote a quick note that appeared in the Danbury Times on July 9th. "There was a fight here yesterday in which our regiment met somewhat of a loss. George Sears, Lewis Bailey, Orrin Bronson, George Brotherton, James Hannon, and myself are prisoners. J.M. Bailey." No further letters arrived from Bailey until late August, and then on September 3, 1863, the Times published the next letter in which he reports that he is free again and that the 45 others from the 17th are with him. He can only write about his feelings of anger and despair. 2 weeks later, on September 17th, the Danbury Times began publishing the full story of Bailey's capture and imprisonment. On July 1st, Bailey had managed to get into Gettysburg and came upon a makeshift hospital, where he took a few minutes to get some water for the wounded of both sides that were already being cared for. Bailey's newspaper article tells the next few moments. "I returned to fill my pail, inwardly estimating how big a piece of Manton would be left in case I should accidentally become absent-minded and profit by his disinterested advice. Just as I reached the well a second time, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and turning about I confronted a corporal in that bewitching gray, who, with a lovely condescending smile, for the reader must never forget his rank, opened conversation. 'Ain't you the one that got the water here just now?' 'I am,' I replied, wondering what the deuce it was to him. 'You're just the man I want, then. You're my prisoner.' I can never forget the smile that played on his face as he delivered the announcement. Bailey marched with other prisoners from Pennsylvania to Richmond, Virginia, to be interred at the prison camp at Belle Isle. The men were entirely out of doors, with only their tents for shelter. Bailey was paroled from the prison after only 2 months, but he contracted malaria and he almost starved. Of his experience, Bailey wrote, "About sunrise, we would awake, and taking our cups, we would go to the sunken barrel at the end of our street and have a wash. Each man would receive 4 ounces of bread, 2 of meat, and about 12 grains of salt to season it." In July of 1863, A. Homer Byington, editor and publisher of the Norwalk Gazette, was working as a reporter for the New York Tribune. Byington arrived at Gettysburg late in the second day of the fighting. Recognizing that he was witnessing a major battle, he attempted to locate a telegraph to send his message. He soon learned that the Confederates had cut the telegraph lines for miles around. Byington hired 100 stragglers using Tribune funds to repair the 5 miles of cut lines between Gettysburg and Washington. Each Signal Corps telegraph wagon carried 5 miles of vulcanized rubber-insulated wire which could be laid quickly on the ground. His line was finally operating following the repulsive Pickett's charge late in the afternoon of July 3rd. Fortunately, Byington located a telegraph operator. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles was a good friend of Byington's. Welles had been a newspaper editor in Hartford before the war with the Hartford Times and the Hartford Evening Press. He knew most of the newspapermen in Connecticut. Byington directed his message to Welles. It made a sensation. "What about this battle? Who is Byington?" "Who are you?" Byington replied. "Abraham Lincoln." "Abraham Lincoln," came the reply. "Ask Uncle Gideon," Byington sent. A few minutes later, Lincoln continued, "Send us more." Byington asked the president for an exclusive for the Tribune. Lincoln agreed, and Byington sent the victorious news. That Byington's message was received directly by Lincoln is not a simple coincidence. Lincoln spent a portion of every day in the telegraph office in the War Department, not far from the White House. He would read every dispatch, tracing the troop movements on a map on the wall. Sometimes when he expected important news, he would stay the night, awaiting messages from the front. The previous fall, when he was writing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln spent many hours in the telegraph office working on the document in relative privacy. Ulysses S. Grant was appointed General-in-Chief of the Armies in March of 1864. His policy with the press was strictly along constitutional lines, no prior restraint. He trusted the gentlemen of the press to do the right thing unless and until someone demonstrated otherwise. Early in May of 1864, Grant's 122,000-man Army of the Potomac was missing. More than 3 days had passed since the last word had been sent to Washington that the Army had crossed the Rapidan. There was no further word, and everyone in Washington, from the president on down, was worried. What had happened? Henry Wing of Norwich, Connecticut, had been wounded severely in the leg in Fredericksburg as a member of the 27th Connecticut Infantry. Now, working as a reporter for the New York Tribune, he was assigned to General Grant's headquarters. He mentioned to Grant that he planned to leave the next morning for Washington, 70 miles away. General Grant asked him if he really expected to get to Washington. Assured that he would certainly try, Grant took him aside and gave him a private message to give directly to Lincoln if he should make it. "If you see the president, tell him from me that whatever happens, there will be no turning back." Henry Wing left at 4 a.m. the next morning, riding his Kentucky breed racing horse, Jesse. He spent the next several hours avoiding Confederate patrols and in some cases acting the part of a copperhead, a Confederate sympathizer, to talk his way out of capture. Finally, he was forced to leave Jesse tied up in some bushes and arrive on foot at Union Mills, where he was able to send a telegraph message to Charles A. Dana, once the Tribune managing editor and now the Assistant Secretary of War. "I am just in from the front. Left Grant at 4 o'clock this morning." The response came from Secretary of War Stanton, not Dana. "Where did you leave General Grant?" Wing was surprised at the answer. He didn't realize that no one in Washington knew where General Grant was. "If Mr. Stanton would let me send 100 words over the government line to the Tribune, I would tell him all that I knew." Secretary of War Stanton was one of the worst enemies of the press. He had even begun to change casualty figures. He would later alter an account of Grant's failure at Petersburg, reducing the losses to about a third of their actual number. His department withheld news of the surrender of Harper's Ferry for 24 hours and changed 10,000 Union troops surrendered first to 6,000 and later dispatches to 4,000. The actual figure was 11,200. Stanton took to suspending newspapers that had broken his censorship rules, arresting editors, threatening proprietors with court-martial, and banning correspondence from the front. Stanton would have none of Henry Wing's request. He actually issued orders for Wing to be arrested and shot the following morning for refusing to hand over his dispatches. Fortunately, the commotion was overheard by Lincoln, who demanded to hear the whole story. The telegraph operator said, "Mr. Lincoln wants to know if you will tell him where Grant is." Wing repeated his offer, and Lincoln accepted at once on the condition that the statement to the Tribune be so full as to disclose to the public the general situation. Lincoln ordered a locomotive to be sent to Union Mills to bring the reporter to Washington. About 2 o'clock in the morning, I reached the White House, where the President had gathered his official family to meet me. As I stepped into the room where they were seated, my glance caught a quick gleam of surprise and apprehension in Mr. Lincoln's eyes, and I was then awakened to the scene of my disreputable appearance. My hair was disheveled, my shabby old coat was dusty and wrinkled, my pantaloons, much too long, were folded back at the bottom and gathered about my ankles with pieces of cotton twine, and my coarse clothes were so coated with 3 or 4 layers thick with sacred soil. After appraising the cabinet of the situation at the Union front, Wing said, "Mr. President, I have a personal word for you." The others withdrew, and Lincoln said, "What is it?" "General Grant told me to tell you that there is to be no turning back." Mr. Lincoln put his great strong arms about me and, carried away by the exuberance of his gladness, imprinted a kiss upon my forehead. Over the next few months, Lincoln insisted that Wing visit him whenever he was in Washington. They often would sit in some quiet place to discuss the latest news from the front. As promised, General Grant took the Army of the Potomac ever forward in the 6 bloodiest weeks of the war. Lee was always prepared with strong defenses, and the battles were furious along the 100-mile crescent. There was sustained fighting from Wilmington to Spotsylvania for 8 days. The Bohemian Brigade kept abreast of it reporting more coherently and with more restraint than in previous campaigns. It was achieved by a cooperative effort with journalists from distant papers taking out the dispatches for the others, and on alternate days, while the rest remained with the Army. Charles A. Dana, managing editor of the New York Times for 15 years, was now the Assistant Secretary of War. Traveling now with Grant's headquarters, he represented a significant departure in government news policy. Secretary of War Stanton began issuing daily reports of the progress of the war based on Dana's dispatches and released them to the Associated Press. Perhaps the most quoted of these reports included the now famous words of General Grant: "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." These terse but authoritative reports continued to the end of the war, evidence that the government had finally accepted the fact that the people must have news. Cold Harbor was one of the deadliest of wall battles, and like the Wilderness, it was fought in dense woods that obscured the fighting. In about 8 minutes, Grant lost 6,000 men in attacks against Lee's well-defended position. Lee lost only 1,500 men. Grant's next move was to slip southeast past Lee's troops on the outskirts of Petersburg. Delays permitted Lee's troops to construct a long line of trenches. The standoff continued for 10 terrible months until the Army of Northern Virginia was desperately out of supplies and attempted a breakout toward Appomattox Courthouse. No artists or correspondents were present on April 9, 1865, to witness the surrender of General Lee to General Grant at the McLean House, but 2 reporters were waiting outside, waiting for a signal: Sylvanus Cadwallader for the Herald and Henry Wing for the Tribune. At 4 p.m., the meeting was finished. The federal officer came out on the porch, doffed his hat, and swiped a handkerchief across his forehead 3 times. This prearranged signal sent the Tribune man on a quick ride to the nearest telegraph key. Henry Wing had no details, but he needed none. He beat the dreaded Herald with a simple dispatch: Lee has surrendered. In 1864, the Philadelphia Press commissioned Thomas Morris Chester, son of an ex-slave, to cover the activities of black troops on the Virginia front. The only black correspondent for a major daily during the Civil War, Chester covered the crucial final year of the war around Richmond. Thomas Morris Chester joined the black troops of the 25th Army Corps as they led the victorious Union forces into Richmond, Virginia. Chester's dispatches constitute the most sustained and extensive first-hand accounts of black soldiers in existence. Henry Wing returned to his home in Litchfield. This is Richmond. Henry Wing returned to his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, where he read the tragic news of the death of his friend, Abraham Lincoln. In 1884, George Alfred Townsend purchased a tract of land on South Mountain near Burkittsville, Maryland, at Crampton's Gap, an area particularly attractive to him because of its proximity to Antietam and other historical sites of the war. Townsend's unique and lasting architectural endeavor is an unusual monument erected in 1896 as a memorial to his fellow war correspondents. The names of 157 correspondents and war artists who saw and described in narratives and pictures almost all of the events of the 4 years of the war are inscribed in tablets in the arch. Thank you. Okay, if I can take some questions, I'll try to answer them if I can. Yes?
Were there any fatalities among, with so many?
There were a few, but it was rare. They really, yes, they were so close to the fighting. There were some imprisoned in Confederate prisons. I think there was at least 2 in Andersonville, but generally they were pretty lucky, I have to say. Yes?
You mentioned that Secretary Stimson issued press releases based on Dana's reporting. Was there anything within the War Department comparable to a Department of Propaganda that we would associate with today?
I don't believe so. I had not read anything to that degree. It was all pretty new, and whether or not there was anything like that. I mean, there were spies. There were many spies during the war, but I didn't connect them to the journalists. Yes.
What was the photography equipment of the time? Was it the large sheet plates?
Right, it was the large glass plate, and it was a wet plate process, and that's why it took several seconds to make an image. And then, for those of you who aren't familiar with the wet plate process, the camera would have to be set up before the plate was brought to the camera. In a black tent, they would have to process it by pouring the chemicals onto the plate, and then put the plate into a light type case, bring it to the camera, set it up, and photograph it, and that's where it would take about 10 to 20 seconds, depending the amount of light during the day. Then they would have to cover it back up and run back to the tent and process that in 7 seconds, within 7 minutes before the plate began to dry. Because if the plate dried before they could develop it and put it in hypo to keep it permanent, then it would destroy the picture. So I mean, it was a tedious process, and they would always have Brady was one of the more famous of the photographers, although, as I said earlier, there were so many. He had operators, we call them operators, who would operate his equipment and take care of things. He would basically be the owner of the equipment. He was the head of his personal studio, so to speak. But his operators would have to be, there'd have to be almost a team where one would take the picture and then get it sent back to the person who was doing the developing in the tent and so on. So that's how, but it was the wet plate process. It wouldn't be until about 10 years after the war that they developed the dry plate process. But it was the wet plate. Any, yes?
Was that considered an art form at that time?
Was it considered an art form? Well, it was a mechanical thing, but there were some people who used it in their art. They would take portraits that were unique. There was well, there were several from around the area, but yes, there were some. But it was mostly business, at least the area that Julia Roberts Cameron, I think her full name was. She was a photographer who did a lot of work with portraits, and she is credited with doing portraits that have a somewhat fuzzy job of them. And I know, well, this happens to be one of my photographs, and I just added the words to it. But I used to take pictures of the battlefields as a youngster. Yes.
I have a question about how the newspapers got to the soldiers. You showed a picture of
Of a wagon.
a wagon with several names on it. Did the papers decide to cooperate, or was the brigade responsible for
Well,
bringing them in?
the newspaper owners obviously wanted to sell as many pictures as they could and as many newspapers as they could.
Right.
And so they were able to get papers that way. Very
Well,
few Confederates, yes.
Were they connected in any, at least the Union deliveries connected in any way with the sutlers that?
Yes, they would be. They would have the, yeah, the settlers were always there, and they were selling anything. And if it happened to be newspapers, in fact, you'd call probably the fellow with the wagon there a settler of some sort. Yes.
You indicated that this was the first modern type war. Was it in the media, in photography? I assume that communications did not use the telegraph at the time. Is that right? So they couldn't get
A lot of that, there were some communications before the war because there were telegraphs. They said they had telegraphs from the west to the Midwest to the East Coast. Telegraph lines and things like that were already being developed.
Yes, I
And
thought so.
then they had the Morse code and so on at that time.
And what about weaponry? Was there?
Weaponry was becoming more and more advanced all the time. There were very few breech-loading cannon. There were some. I know at Gettysburg they had some English rifles, cannon. They were breech-loading. Most of them were muzzle-loaded with the. So I mean, they were starting to develop. And the thing that really confuses me, I have not ever found a really good reason for it. During the Revolutionary War, the American soldiers learned the best thing they could fight from was behind a stone wall. But in the Civil War, they began using the Napoleonic technique of coming and marching with full lines of men and everything. And it'd say, wait a minute, why didn't they fight behind stone walls and so on, you know? They did sometimes, I guess, but most of it was out in the open. And it was, the weaponry was getting better and better. I mean, it wasn't just that they had to use a lot of firepower to do any good. They were getting pretty accurate. So there were a lot. In medicine, too. Medicine was very, very primitive at that time. They didn't have, a lot of medicine. All they could do in many cases was amputate broken limbs. And of course, a lot of the weaponry was using things that would cause serious wounds to bones and everything else. And the only thing they could do to save a person's life was to amputate limbs. And I won't go into lots of detail, but there are stories that are horrifying.
Anesthetics.
Excuse me?
I mean, no anesthesia.
That's right. You had a bullet between your teeth, I guess.
Shot of alcohol.
Maybe a shot of alcohol. It was very primitive. That was one of the slowest advancing things. And a lot of the doctors, I don't think they were particularly trained very well. They didn't have they had medical schools, but not as many as they needed, obviously. So, any others? Yes.
You talk about the New York Times and New York papers. What about the Southern? Were there any Southern?
There were, but in the South, they had a lot of problems with lack of paper big enough industry to, there were some, but I haven't found a southern newspaper reporter. I've looked for it, but I don't have it yet. I've been looking for it, I should say, yes. Any others?
The business of trying to develop an anesthesia, I don't believe that chloroform was available at the time, was it?
Honestly, I don't know.
The expression bite the bullet.
Right.
I've actually examined a bullet that was used during the Civil War.
Uh-huh.
And of course, that was the critical moment when a leg and an arm would come off.
Right.
And the examination of this showed tooth marks
Right.
on a piece of lead
Right.
that had been preserved for quite a long time
Right.
by a family.
Mm.
And there was nothing better, apparently, at the time.
No, it was, if there was anything, it was relative, it was very scarce. Wasn't available at the battlefield. Things. There are stories about the Antietam Church, the Dunker Church at Antietam, piles of limbs outside the window. Six. Any others? On a happier note, yes.
You said in 8 minutes, 6,000 troops killed.
In the full war,
Yeah.
over 820, and they're talking about it being as many as 700,000 troops, Americans were killed. What you have to realize is we're talking now, Americans were Southern Americans and Northern Americans fighting against each other. And that's why that number is so high. And because the war was really a very vicious war with weapons, cannon being fired into